after that Coriolanus mishap, maybe I should find someone else.
Sweet, sweet vengeance. You're alive.
Good. So today I wanted to talk about prose, which we really haven't talked about, and it's an interesting thing to talk about because 28% approximately of Shakespeare is in prose. That's over a quarter of the work, and we spend a lot of time talking about verse. And even though I've complained about how verse is taught in many institutions, sort of by rote, etc., and without practical application in mind, it is taught. People are sort of giving a basic breakdown of at least the basics of scansion and iambic pentameter, etc. But we really don't touch on prose, and I think there are two reasons for that that might be sort of contradictory. I think one is that we assume it's more modern and naturalistic, and so it looks like our writing, so do we have to address it technically? And like so many things I'll be talking about tonight, I think that is sometimes maybe true, but certainly not always. And then secondly, unlike verse, you don't see a structure of hard and fast rules. So even if you don't buy into this sort of modern naturalistic, why do we have to talk about it angle, people aren't generally taught the quote unquote rules of prose because it's harder to understand them without the structure of verse. So I think those are the reasons it's addressed less. And I'm going to return to both, but first I just want to talk about prose itself for a second. So, you know, one major question is why does Shakespeare use prose? Why does he make these shifts? And I have had, and I'm sure some of you have had teachers that will tell you stuff like, well, he uses prose for his low-born characters and not for his high-born characters. That's not true. There are examples of it being true. I think Henry IV might be the clearest sort of delineation where the tavern and the lowlifes are speaking in prose most of the time, not always. And King Henry's court speaks in verse most of the time, but not always. And it is true that you will often see sort of some of the nameless characters, you know, Citizen 1, Citizen 2, they usually speak in prose. So maybe there is an element of the common touch to it. I don't want to disqualify that entirely, but anybody that tells you that's the rule is just not looking at the work, not looking at the fullness of the canon. It's just not true across the board. You can't lay a rule like that down. You know, you have the gardeners in Richard II speaking in verse. You know, so does the groom at the end of the play. There are plenty of common people that speak in verse in Shakespeare, and very often highborn speak in prose, and very often lowborn speak in verse. You can say that it does happen more often than not that your royal court scenes are in verse, and that your scenes amongst the street are in prose. But that's, again, it's not true often enough to make it a rule. So if we say there are no set reasons, there might be recurring themes, but there's no set reasons. You know, we do have to ask the question, so why use prose? If we can't break it down to this sort of set reason. And I think sort of the key question when approaching prose, especially in comparison to verse, is not to ask, is not so much to ask what it's doing differently, although that's important, and we'll get into that a little later, but more asking why we have shifted, why Shakespeare has shifted either from one scene to another, or from one place to another, from one character to another, or between characters in a scene. So it happens a lot that we shift from prose to verse, and like the earlier stuff, I don't think there's a general rule for it, but I do think when you look at the shifts from prose to verse, there is always a reason, and often it's interpretive, but often it's pretty obvious, unless you're sort of really going out on a limb for something. What that shift is about might take a little digging, but it's really interesting, and it will tell you something about it. So for example, we have Brutus and Antony in the Forum in Julius Caesar, and Brutus comes out and surprisingly delivers his speech in prose, right? So This is a noble-born character. He speaks in verse most of the play. I won't say he never speaks in prose again, but certainly most of the play he speaks in verse. And one would expect him to speak in verse. And then Antony, delivering one of the Western canon's most famous speeches, who is a soldier. The idea is that he's sort of a man of the people, at least that is the appeal he is trying to make. He speaks in rigorous verse. So you have to ask yourself the question, why? That's both as a director, but also as the two actors playing Brutus and Antony. What are we doing with this verse and this prose? My opinion is that Brutus, to wrap back to our sort of rule of lowborn, highborn, I think Brutus is speaking in prose in an attempt to take on a common voice, in an attempt to appeal to the common people. And I think it's interesting, and I think I can hear that he's not good at it. We don't often, Antony's speech so overshadows Brutus' speech that it's an interesting thing to look at. And I think it's, to me, I can hear that he's uncomfortable doing it. Antony, the soldier, potentially the man of the people, is incredibly good at bringing forth anger. It will be his key throughout the next play and a half. He is very good at driving people into a rage. And in this case, he's doing it, so he's very comfortable. Antony, in the verse, is much more the common man, and he is very comfortable, whereas Brutus is using the prose in an attempt to speak that way, and he fails at it. Now, he does initially convince much of the crowd that perhaps it was justified, so he doesn't fail entirely, but he's nothing to Antony, as the play makes clear. In Merchant of Venice, you have scene separation. The scenes in Venice are all in prose. Now, I say all, the play opens in verse, there are exceptions, but almost everything in Venice is in prose, with the until we get to the court, when we get to a bunch of verse. Almost everything in Belmont is in verse. So in the sort of practical, mercantile world of Venice, Shakespeare chooses to use prose, whereas in the sort of more romantic, adventuresome world of Belmont, we often are in verse. Now, not always. Portia and Nerissa have a wonderful scene in prose, but that is out of the light of their performances. So for them, prose is the easier language of friendship, whereas verse is the more romantic language of dealing with, certainly Bassanio, but dealing with outsiders coming into Belmont. So is there a hard and fast rule about these things? No, but Shakespeare has clearly made choices, and we can hear the difference in the mercantile language of Venice and the romantic language of Belmont. So while there's no rule that says this way is one thing and this way is another, he is using these two tools to differentiate the places. And there's a wonderful moment after Bassanio has picked the right casket, he's won Portia, and this is a long, gorgeous scene of verse. And then the letter comes from one of the two salads, I forget which one. And it's the letter from Antonio telling his dear friend about the loss of his ships and the sinking of his fortunes and his probable coming death. And the letter is in prose. And so this long scene of verse comes to a crashing halt on the prose of mercantile Venice. Now, the scene comes to a halt also on the terrible news, but it is an invasion of the dirtier, lower world of Venice and of money crashing in to the more idealized Belmont. Another really interesting scene, and this is between characters, and this is between characters shifting in a scene, is Desdemona in Emilia. I attached this on your email. If you want to follow along, I would encourage you to take a look at it now. This is, I didn't even mark the act and scene. What is it? I will find it. This is Act 4, Scene 3. It's near the end of the scene. I've sent this to you because the MIT Shakespeare site doesn't have all the lineation I want to look at. But starting with Desdemona's "Oh, these men, these men." So that should be at the top of your attachment. It's the verse prose example attachment. I'll give everybody a second to find it, but take a look at it. I'm going to read through it. And what I want to look at is that we shift from verse to prose, we shift from verse to prose to verse to prose to verse. So there's 5 shifts in this little scene. I think there's 5, maybe there's 4, but I'll confirm in a second. And it's really interesting to look at why. And now Carly and I worked on Emilia earlier and had a lovely time looking at that speech and taking a look at the fact that Emilia surprisingly shifts into verse at the end. So we'll get there. So we start in verse. Desdemona says, "Oh, these men, dost thou in conscience think, tell me, Emilia, that there be women do abuse their husbands in such gross kind? There be some such, no question. Wouldst thou do such a deed for all the world? Why, would not you? No, by this heavenly light. Nor I neither by this heavenly light. I might do it as well in the dark." So we shift from verse to prose. So Desdemona, in her more innocent, I don't want to call it romantic, but idealized world, where the abuse of her husband has come as such a shock, it was so unprecedented and unexpected, she is fighting to avoid the truth of it. And she's appealing to Emilia to say that women wouldn't do this, right? And Emilia sort of brings her to the ground. She says, well, that's not true. I think they would. And when she gets to these sort of the entendres of doing it as well in the dark, she switches to prose. Right away, Desdemona resists that prose. I love looking at the sort of push and pull of this, right? So Desdemona resists this prose and stays in verse to say, wouldst thou do such a deed for all the world? And Emilia, staying in prose, says, the world's a huge thing. It is a great price for a small vice. And Desdemona finally, in the wake of Emilia's prose, joins her in the prose, which is surprising. I couldn't say for certain. I don't know if we've ever seen her in prose before. And she says, in troth, I think thou wouldst not. But you can hear in that line, at least I think you can hear in that line, her doubt, right? Doubt is being sown, first by her husband's action, and then by Emilia's, I think Emilia is being playful. I think she's trying to cheer up Desdemona, but she is telling her the truth. And then, and then we go into her reasons. In troth, I think I should, and undo it when I had done. Mary, I would not do such a thing for a joint ring, nor for measures of lawn, nor for gowns, petticoats, nor caps, nor any petty exhibition, but for the whole world. Why? Who would not make her husband a cuckold to make him a monarch? I should venture purgatory for it. And Desdemona stays in prose. Beshrew me if I would do such a thing for the whole world. Why, the wrong is but a wrong of the world. And having the world for your labor, 'tis a wrong in your own world. And you might quickly make it right. I do not think there is any such woman. And then Emilia's first line is in prose. And then sort of shockingly, she switches to verse. And she says, yes, a dozen. And as many to the vantage as would store the world they played for. And then there's a marked shift, and you hear it. But I do think it is their husband's fault if wives do fall. Say that they slack their duties and pour our treasures into foreign land, or else break out in peevish jealousies, throwing restraint upon us. Or say they strike us, or scant our former having in despite. Why, we have galls, and though we have some grace, yet have we some revenge. Let husbands know their wives have sense like them. They see and smell, and have their palates both for sweet and sour, as husbands have. What is it that they do when they change us for others? Is it sport? I think it is. And doth affection breed it? I think it doth. Is frailty that thus errs? It is so too. And have not we affections, desires for sport, and frailty as men have? And let them use us well. Else let them know the ills we do, their ills instruct us so. Which is an amazing speech, and is so fascinating because Emilia has never spoken like this before. We have never heard her talk like this before. We have seen her negotiate with her husband about the handkerchief. We've seen her with Desdemona on the docks. We have never heard her talk like this before. And so something in the movement of prose to verse, that's what's key. That's what's interesting. There is, again, there may be hints, there may be commonalities enough for you to say, well, common people speak in prose, or maybe more sexual languages in prose, or maybe more poetic languages in verse. But those are often enough not true that I don't think you can sort of live by them as you go through the work. The key question is, why do we shift? Why do we shift in a scene? Why does a character shift? Why do we shift scene to scene? And and in the world, why do certain scenes happen in a verse world and certain scenes happen in prose world? Those questions will tell you so much about the play, and they will tell you so much about the characters. And you can hear the difference in the prose and the verse. So I've spent a while now talking about those shifts. Practically in playing prose, what I like about this, I think next week and the following week, maybe, I'm going to do a pair of lectures on auditioning for classical theater. So we've been really focused on craft from the beginning of the class till now. And it's really important to me to stay focused on craft. I never want to I love Shakespeare. I can get into the theory and heady stuff and have a great time talking about it. But I don't want to be doing that I generally don't want to do that with these lectures. I will go on tangents sometimes. I know it. But I want these to be practically applicable. I want to give you tools. And so coming to prose and thinking about prose was nice for me, because I realized that as I was going to address what was practical about prose, I get to sort of do a review of much of the lectures we've done to this point. Because the truth is, you approach prose in many of the same ways you approach verse. You just don't have verse's structure to hold you up. So there's a bit more on your shoulders. But Shakespeare also gives you this wonderful flowing rhythm of no line stops that also lets you sort of ride the wave in a way that verse doesn't always offer you. So I'm going to go over some practicalities. But this coming to prose was nice. It's a nice end stop to the lectures. I'm not going to stop the lectures, but we'll get to review a bit here. And then it'll be a different kind of practicality. But I think for the next lecture or two, we're going to look at my experience and advice on auditioning for classical theater, and the various ways you can do it in various places, and the various pieces you can use, and etc. Why do we not talk about prose? Sometimes people think it's modern and naturalistic, and we don't need to look at it because it's the way we talk now. Look no further than What a Piece of Work is a Man, and you have a nice, gorgeous prose speech that is as poetic as they get. It's wonderful, but it doesn't have any of our sort of naturalistic modern cadence to it. I mean, we are going through some heights of poetry. And then the idea of lack of rules, which is untrue. We just don't have the obvious structure of the verse. So key, and this was lecture 1, and I will keep coming back to it, overemphasis is death. It's the worst way to get lost. It's the way that good actors, well-speaking actors, an audience zones out to them. You see it all the time. Or I should say, you hear it all the time. Overemphasis is death. So operative choice, operative words. You have to draw the map over the prose of picking your operative words. This word to this word to this word. These are the points. Everything in between, you need variation on, but you cannot overemphasize. Sometimes the danger will be to hit everything on your way to your argument. So pick your operative words. Another thing is that you must keep the thrust of your vocal energy moving forward. You see this in verse sometimes when I give the note, or you hear it, when people drop off their line endings. It's an American thing to do, where we're speaking and we let the end of our point come down. It's not how Shakespeare wrote. And there's no line endings to warn you about it in prose. You have to keep the vocal energy driving up. Now, that doesn't mean you can't tonally shift down, but you have to be making that choice, and you can keep the vocal energy hot without, it doesn't necessarily have to be a volume build, but you have to keep the vocal energy driving forward. And per our third lecture, you must continually be seeking the shifts and discoveries amongst the prose. You must find the new ideas. This stays with our lecture about argument. Prose speeches have a tendency to go on more tangents, especially you look at a part like Falstaff, where we sweep off to one thing, we sweep off to another. But you must always be bringing it back to the argument. You must always be seeking out the argument. And in prose, we can get a little more lost, but it remains equally as key as verse. In verse, we often get more lost in the poetry. In prose, we often get more lost in the tangents. We must continually return to the argument. And again, if you want to talk about it in a sort of more method context, you could call it objective, you could call it intention, you could call it action. Whatever word you prefer for it, you are returning to the argument. And without the verse structure, you have to map it yourself. Now, I like to use slashes when I'm notating stuff for shifts. You can notate it however you like, but you have to create a structure of each point and each shifting point in the prose. Often it becomes meaningless when it all blends together. Ithamar asked me on the Facebook group to at some point address Shakespeare's clowns, which I will do, and I look forward to doing. This is a huge thing for the clowns. They speak in large chunks of prose. It's often archaic, and there are a ton of tangents. But a key to the clowns is always coming back to their argument. They have an argument to make. So good, never losing the argument. And the key, per our lecture 2 weeks ago, the true key in so much prose, Brutus's speech in Caesar is an obvious example of it. Antithesis and balancing one idea against another is the most key factor in finding your operative words. Shakespeare writes in this system of opposing strains. They're everywhere, and they're everywhere in prose, equally so to verse. Seek your antithesis, find them, frame them up, lift them against each other. They are the key to your operative phrases. They're not every operative word, but they are the largest thing that will help you get there. And with like piece of work is man, like pieces of Falstaff and Daltersheet, there are many examples. There you will find poetry in the prose, and that poetry, like the poetry of verse, has to be, you're dealing with heightened language. You have to coin it, frame it, lift it, and lean into it just enough. You don't want to indulge in recitation. You don't want to go that far into affectation, but you can't ignore that you're dealing with heightened language. And so, like in the verse, you must lift it. So I said this is partially a review. The rules of prose are much the same as verse. The key is, why are we using two different frameworks? And what is Shakespeare doing with those frameworks? So our rules are similar, though our structure is different. The much more interesting question with prose is why? Why have we shifted? What is Shakespeare doing with this prose that he wasn't doing with the verse, or vice versa? And so that's my chat about prose. Are there any questions? If there are, please use the raise hand option in the participants menu, and I would be happy to address any of them. No? Great. So next week,